Happy Friday, Baylor College of Medicine and friends of Baylor. Well, my sister's mad at me again. This time it's because she's confused because Tony Fauci said it's going to be over and New York's not looking so good. So hang on, Janet. We'll talk a little bit about what's going on. First, let's think about what's going on nationally. Interestingly enough, we are beginning to have a little bit of a tick upward as we predicted. And you know, it's funny, if you look at the case number, that is documented case number, it's almost 81 million, and we know that's a vast underestimation. And so, you know, if you think 2 to 3 times more people were actually infected, that's like 240, 250 million, which is why the country is probably, you know, approaching herd immunity, at least from the original virus. The problem is, as the virus changes, more and more people become susceptible, and that has implications for what's happening down the road. In the world, it's not much different. The case numbers keep coming down. Europe's getting a little bit better. Australia, still hot. And of course, if you've been on the news, Hong Kong is still very hot, and Beijing is now beginning to have cases. And they're still in the lockdown in Shanghai, and nobody's happy in China. Well, what about in our country? I mentioned there's a couple of new emerging hotspots, the Northeast, New York in particular, Midwest, Rio Grande Valley in Texas, the Pacific Northwest, parts of Alaska and Puerto Rico. And it's because of the changing nature of the virus. The virus is mutating. Again, we have a new set of mutations that I'll talk about. Because of that, if you look at the differences between vaccinated and unvaccinated, the differences in infection rate have begun to narrow. So it is, you're still way better off being vaccinated, but you know, you have probably twofold the protection. So, you know, it used to be tenfold. Well, it's now 2 to 3-fold. If you look at protection from serious disease, though, it's still tenfold. And if you have been fully vaccinated plus boosted, it's almost 20-fold. So a lot of benefit from serious disease and protection from serious disease if you're vaccinated and boosted. But the infection rate is happening fairly common. And I know, and I'm sure many of you know people who have been fully vaccinated and still got infected. Most of those people are either asymptomatic or not very ill or recover. So the benefit of vaccines are still there. One of the interesting things is the demographics of who's really getting seriously ill and passing away from this disease are also changing. In early September of this year, about 23%, only 23% of people who died were vaccinated. But because of Omicron, that number's been going up. And it looks like the elderly are particularly at risk. So the elderly accounted for 42% of deaths, and many of them were already vaccinated. So what you're seeing over time is even the elderly who are vaccinated, but because immunity is waning, the virus is changing, many of them are immune compromised, you're beginning to see the death rate climb in people who are elderly, even though they've been vaccinated. So that's just one of the problems with this pandemic, is that the virus keeps changing and our immunity is waning over time. If you look at Texas, Harris County is doing pretty well, and our friends in Dimmitt County are doing great. Unfortunately, Rio Grande Valley doesn't look so good, and around Laredo it's a big outbreak. But we're doing okay here, and if you look at our local community numbers, and this is the number most people should follow, is what's your community number. We're down to about 350 or 360 cases per day in our Texas Medical Center network, and that's about 10 to 15 cases per 100,000, which is considered a very low infection rate. And our hospitalizations have been constant over the last 5 weeks, just about 60 per day. So all in all, locally, we're doing pretty well. So what are the projections for the future? Well, the CDC projections, they're all over the map. The 50% chance that they'll go just a slight increase, but as you can see, the deltas are pretty wide, so it's possible we could have a spike. And if you talk to many of the folks who are in this field, the concern as immunity wanes towards the end of the summer and these new variants emerge, we may very well have a late summer spike, just as we did each of the last 2 summers. So what's going on with the variants? Well, you know, Omicron is the major variant. The BA1 was the first Omicron variant, but BA2 here in pink has replaced it. And there's a new variant, BA2.12.1, which is also emerging now. And if you look at the map of where the variants are, you can see over the New England and New York City in particular, it's that newest variant that seems to be driving the new infection rates in New York City. So Janet, that's why it's a problem in New York. So, we're just going to, again, it's always wait and see. But if I were, in New York in a crowded place, I'd probably be a little bit more cautious. A couple of interesting things about the evolution of virus. There are trees that we do to connect relatedness. So with each mutation, we can sequence that and we can compare that to other virus mutations. And you can figure out what the common ancestors were. And you can then construct a relatedness tree. And that's what this kind of diagram is. And you can see each of the branches represents a new mutation. So delta was way over here. And you can see these other alpha and gamma and lambda were more closely related to delta. But as you move out, Omicron was really a big jump in mutations. Remember, they had a bunch of mutations. But as you see, the BA.1 mutation and the BA.2 are sort of separating as two different genealogies. So those lines are separating. And if you look at what the difference is between BA.2 and BA.1, BA.2 is about 1.5 times more infectious. It is somewhat resistant to antibodies generated against BA.1. So just because you got BA.1 doesn't mean you can't get reinfected with BA.2. That's why we're seeing reinfections. The other thing about the BA.2 spike protein is in animal models, particularly the hamster model, it looks like it might be more virulent. So there may be an uptick in hospitalizations and death with that one also. There are two new Omicron variants, BA4 and BA5. We talked a little bit about last week, but BA4 and BA5 particularly emerging in South Africa. And you can see the big new cases in South Africa. There have also been cases of BA4 found in Denmark, Botswana, Scotland, and England. BA5 right now is limited to South Africa and Botswana, but the fact is there are not a lot of these cases, but the fact that they're emerging and replicating means that it's likely going to continue to stick and may well grow. We'll just have to wait and see. We just don't know. Now, there was one really good paper in Nature Microbiologist this week looking at not humoral but T-cell responses. And what they looked at is a bunch of people who were convalescent from infection, in other words, they got infected and recovered, versus those that had a vaccine against SARS-CoV-2. And the interesting thing is if you're infected with the virus, your T-cell response is to many different parts of the virus. So you can imagine there's the spike proteins, but there's the envelope protein, all the other proteins that make up a virus, and your T-cells respond to all of those. Interestingly enough, the major response is not to the spike protein. But if you look at the T-cell responses to the vaccination, which is just the spike protein, not surprisingly, you have T-cell responses only to the spike protein, but interestingly, to many different parts of that spike protein. So that's one of the reasons why getting vaccinated is better, because you have a much broader repertoire of T-cell responses to the spike protein. And then the other interesting thing is, because of this is a good reason why even if you've been infected, you should be vaccinated. But the point of that is that because you have this broad immunity towards all parts of the spike protein, including the receptor binding domain, it may be very important for cross immunity. In other words, even though you've been infected with one strain, many of the strains have the same receptor binding domain, and if your T cells are responding to the vaccine, it's very likely you will have immunity to many different strains. So I think that's why you're seeing this giant difference between the death rate, mortality rate in those who are vaccinated versus unvaccinated, because no matter what the strain is, you probably have a T-cell response that is ready to go if infected. So that was very interesting. Some other vaccine news. The FDA approved remdesivir that's not a vaccine, that's a treatment. But the FDA approved remdesivir for treating young children. And in the vaccine news, Moderna just asked the FDA to authorize its vaccine for children under 6. We'll just have to wait and see. And then one other really interesting thing, remember we talked about white-tailed deer. I hate white-tailed deer. I mean, they're very pretty and elegant animals, but they're constantly eating all the flowers in my garden, all of them. Every time I plant something, the tulip heads are gone, the azaleas are dying. And if you get up early in the morning, you can see why. The whole family's out there eating them. Well, those lovely white-tailed deer, hundreds of them have tested positive for SARS-CoV-2. Now, just to put it in perspective, there are 30 million deer living in the United States. There's that one deer for every human. And they're all over the place. And the concern is that they actually might be carrying SARS-CoV-2. So if you look at fawns in captivity, this was a study done last year. they can be infected with SARS-CoV-2 and they can spread it to other fawns that are nearby. The concern, of course, is they don't get particularly ill and they develop antibodies that are clearly infected, and so they could easily represent, like bats, another reservoir. What surprised most scientists is the other ungulates, like cows, sheep, and goats, do not get infected. So it's just something with the white-tailed deer. Now, you remember we talked about this last year, but in sort of reviewing all the data, there was a sequence in Ohio deer that was exactly the same sequence that was in humans. So it was pretty clear that it spilled over probably from humans to deer at that time. And when doing a fairly extensive sequence analysis, it happened probably 5 or 6 times in Ohio, I should say, the Ohio. So because of this reservoir that's appearing, researchers have been looking at the presence of deer that are infected in various states. So because of this experience in Ohio, they've looked at other states, and now 24 of 30 states have deer that are carrying COVID, are positive for COVID. And the concern, of course, is that this could represent a reservoir, because not only have they been doing the sequence in the comparing man to human, but in the deer reservoir, the virus is also mutating and changing. So the concern is, can it mutate and then jump back to humans? It's a big issue. It's not been in Europe yet, so this seems to be just specific for North America, and Canada. And the Canadian infection rate is much lower, 1% to 6%. Of what it is in the U.S. But it's a big concern. You know, one of the things we showed in the Wuhan wet markets was they were selling deer there too. So we don't know exactly. We think pangolin was the original species that jumped from bat to pangolin, but there might have been an intermediate species that could be deer. So a bunch of shout outs this week. A lot of things to celebrate this week. U.S. News and World Report reported out its top 100 high schools in America, and Baylor and the Houston Independent School District partnered 50 years ago to establish the first health science school, DeBakey High School, and it was ranked number 50 in the country. So that was very exciting, and number 7 in Texas. Also, Common Spirit, our one of the largest not-for-profit health systems that we partner with Baylor St. Luke's Medical Center, looked at the most impactful clinical research program, and Dr. Gibbs and Dr. Ballantine received the Common Spirit Physician Enterprise Academic Excellence Award for work that they're doing on the genomics of understanding cardiovascular disease risk. This also marks the beginning of National Nurses Week. We know the nursing profession has taken a real hit through this last 2 years. Many thanks to all the nurses who work at Baylor and everywhere. If you're a nurse, we're all behind you. We just wish you'd stick it out. Keep hanging in there. And finally, one giant big shout out to Dusty Baker, the manager of the Houston Astros, who this week became the 12th Major League Baseball manager in history to reach 2,000 wins. So congratulations, Dusty, and all of the Astros. And I want to do a special thanks for George Fedone, a pediatrician that's out in Lufkin. He's been following Lily in my podcasts or YouTube broadcasts, and he also a good friend and a good colleague. As a bit of thanks, he decided he would paint a portrait of Lily. And so Lily and I really appreciate it. Thank you, George. Really appreciate it. It's a beautiful job, and I hope to show it to everyone. Thank you, George. So anyway, have a great weekend, and I can't wait to see you next week. Lily, what happened in the picture? Lily, what happened in the picture? It was hanging up on the wall. What'd you do with it? Where'd it go?